Hello and welcome to the Southbound Sports Show. I'm your host, Richie Leahy, here with my co-host, Maddie B. It finally happened. The Big Ten did exactly what I said they were going to do. Not quite exactly, but they're pretty close, Matt. USC and UCLA left the Pac-12 last week, right before the 4th of July weekend, immediately joined the Big Ten. And I had called that USC and Notre Dame were going to come to the Big Ten because it makes the most sense. And Notre Dame hasn't made a decision yet. There's rumors swirling that they're trying to save the ACC, which I could see because, I mean, you get preferential treatment. Why would you not want to save that, right? So before we get into it, I want to get your thoughts. How safe do you think Florida State is right now, and what do you think about the move?
Well, I want to think that they should be exploring options, but I don't know how feasible it's going to be for them to get out, because I mean, when you look at the way that the split has been, I kind of thought from a we've talked before about travel, that it makes sense for Florida State to stay in the SEC and to be around those southern programs and kind of keep some of that. I was actually shocked that USC and UCLA joined the Big Ten, and I thought with the way that some of those, like the big noon games, going to kick off at 9 a.m. when they're playing some of those games. Like, I think what stood out to me was that it looks like you have ESPN and Fox battling each other, and the rest of college football is being used as pawns on this bigger game. And I guess a different comparison would be the way that the AFL and the NFL leveraged each other to merge. Like, it almost has that same type of feel where you have the Big Ten trying to pull schools in, you have the SEC competitively bringing schools in, and it's like they're both trying to pull better programs in for the viewership for their TV deals, and ESPN having the ACC rights, there's no push for the SEC to include any of the ACC schools into the merger, because they're already getting those contracts regardless. So there's not a push for them. Where I think when you're looking at can they poach to the Big Ten, the ACC schools might be more at play because of the way that it's structured. But looking at how the ACC has their buyouts, it would have to take the Big Ten to pull like at least 4 or 5 teams to just dissolve the conference altogether. Otherwise, the buyouts are through the roof.
It's not just the buyout. The buyout's supposedly only $100 million, and I think that's similar to what Maryland paid. Didn't they get it down to like $50 million or something? Like, they negotiated out of it. I assume that would happen here. The big key you brought up is ESPN, and you're spot on with the NFL. Like, we talked about it. NFC is on Fox, right? The AFC is on CBS. The rest of the games they kind of pitch between other networks. Like, whatever game the networks take, that's what they're going to get. I think that's the big mistake that the SEC made. And I'm looking at it for this show only from a business perspective, nothing from like the Michigan side of things as a fan. From the business side, the SEC made the same mistake that the ACC did. They signed an exclusive deal with ESPN, right? So if you're reading articles on this realignment stuff and you see a bunch of like propaganda about SEC this, SEC that, make sure you're reading it from a non-biased source, which is going to be kind of hard because, like you said, if you're reading it from Fox, they're coming at it from the side of the Big Ten. If you're reading at it on ESPN, and I've seen a couple of ESPN beat writers write about like how the ACC is fine right now. It's like, it's not fine. The ACC has taken a deal that goes to 36. So 2036, I believe, is the deal where they're getting paid way less than the other conferences. Like, it's even with the grant of rights, and what the grant of rights means is ESPN's going to own the television rights for the ACC games. That's kind of what leans me towards like Florida State and Clemson maybe being able to jump to the SEC, because ESPN owns all the rights for the SEC now. They got rid of the CBS contract, which I think is a big mistake. Where the Big Ten sitting right now, they're telling CBS, like, hey, you can have a game, just pay us some extra money. NBC, you want a game? Pay us some extra money. ESPN, you guys still want some games? Yeah, sure. Take a few games. Like, we don't care. And so they're getting all this extra money where the SEC is like, no, we're just going to sit with ESPN. And part of the ESPN deal was rolling in the Longhorn Network, which they were already paying. So if you actually look at the payouts, the Big Ten's been on top for years now. Like, you hear about how SEC's on top, SEC's on top. Yeah, in championships, they have been. But in terms of money, they haven't been. And even the projections, Matt, I sent you some stats, and I was laughing at them because right now I think the SEC got more this past year because they set up some COVID numbers where the SEC took some advances and something to do with the Big Ten not having states that allowed like revenue from the stadium or whatever just because of COVID restrictions. And ESPN then projected that the Big Ten would be back on top again this year, making $57 million, where the SEC is probably going to make $54 million. The Big Ten, their contract is up. That's how I knew USC was most likely going to jump, because the Pac-12 asked them to sign to their television network, and they said no. Like, why would you say no if you were going to stay in the Pac-12, right? I didn't think that they would jump to the SEC. The other move would have been to go independent, and I think that would have been a real dick move, right? To be like, hey guys, we're not going to play football with you anymore, but we'd like to play other sports. And I think the Pac-12 would be like, no, get out of here. So they said, you know what, let's see what UCLA wants to do. I find it hard to believe that they didn't ask Notre Dame at all, right? Because like I feel like Notre Dame they're the Rose. And if you're going to be pointing out like, hey, we might make more money than the Big Ten, like the SEC, now that we have Texas. We don't know for sure, because looking at the projections, in 2024, the Big Ten is going to be up towards, how come their graph doesn't have money? I would assume close to like 80 million, like was what the rumor was, while the SEC is still making only 50 to 60 million. Even whenever Texas M joined, they're supposed to roll in the extra, 15 million per year? Which gets them to about to like 75 to 80. So they'd be close, but still a little bit behind the Big Ten. Now with UCLA and USC, the Big Ten, the latest number that Fox put out was with their contract, selling a couple extra games to NBC and CBS, each school is looking at over $105 to $110 million a year right now. Now that could change, but man, that's putting you $20 million ahead of the SEC in the same year that Texas joins, right? So if you're ESPN, are you willing to cut schools from the ACC that you're already paying for, very cheap, by the way, to say like, hey, we're going to have to pay you guys a little bit more if you join the SEC? I just don't see it from a business side of things. ESPN's been losing subscribers. They've been cutting costs. Remember, they signed that massive NBA deal, and they've had to drop. They've had to drop some of it. NBA players have lost some of their salary or whatever. And now you're looking at it from college football. How are you going to say, you know what, we've already locked in these guys for, 38? What does it say? So the ACC should be locked in around, oh my God, $30 million a year, right? For this year, for their rights. How are you going to say, you know what, Clemson, we're going to give you $50 million more if you just join the SEC, where guess what? You're not going to be the king anymore. You're just going to be another school that is there, right? I don't think they're going to do that, right?
But I think even with like the ACC network, it's been so infuriating to try to get games, because you have to pay for this double secret plan to make sure that you have access to the games that you really want to watch from the network. Like a lot of it, you end up with a SEC front load, and outside of like a Florida State Miami, you're not going to get, or Florida State Clemson, you're not going to see a lot of those games on any of the main networks. They'll be on ESPN2, ESPN News, pay for, ACC network to make sure you have it. But I think like that's one of the things that makes it a lot more challenging.
So it looks like what's it say? So ESPN extended like the NBA deal to like 2025, and some of their losses were due to COVID, right? And I'm sure that whatever they're getting in terms of like viewership. So like for the conference and stuff too, if you're looking at pure like data from these schools, and the funny thing is like UCLA and USC, they don't pump the numbers, right? They're there to literally get the Big Ten into the second biggest media market. Kind of like Rutgers gets them New York. Because if there was a reason, like let's say there was a study that ESPN did that said, hey, actually Rutgers doesn't get you New York, Syracuse does. Syracuse would be in the SEC the next day. Right? Like that would be a no-brainer. Because it looks like both conferences are going to be piggybacking. Fox is saying, hey, we've had success with the NFL. Let's get into California. Let's get into Chicago. Make sure we're in New York with like the Rutgers deal and everything. People laughed at it, but Fox is behind it. And I keep hearing about how, oh, this is dumb. People are cutting cable. Fox is an over-the-air channel. It's free. ESPN is the paid cable channel. So if anyone's getting hurt by cutting cable, it's the SEC and the ACC, right? I mean, Fox puts games on, whatever, but the way the Big Ten's been setting this up, they're putting their games on networks that are free. NBC is rumored to want to buy one to put on ahead of Notre Dame games. I mean, if the Notre Dame joins the Big Ten, then that's a no-brainer. They just buy 2 games, right? And they're going to be on NBC proper. And so you're going to have your Saturday games where the free channels before ABC might show the Big 12 or the Big 10 at noon, or hell, the Big 12, whichever one they picked. 3:30 was the free SEC game on CBS. That's no longer there. So is ABC going to say, like, we're cutting the Big 10 out completely, and we're going to show one SEC game at noon, one SEC game at 3:30, and one SEC game at what was their other time slot? 8? What's the game day slot? 8 o'clock? 8 or 7:30, something like that. So those are the main ESPN slots. How ridiculous would it be if the SEC was only shown on like 2 of those? Like if ABC did the 3:30 SEC now and then the primetime SEC. But some of those game day games, those are Big Ten games. So like, are they going to not show Ohio State, Penn State? Are they not going to show? Well, hell, now it would be like Michigan, USC. Like, are they going to not show that game and make us watch Mississippi, Auburn? I don't know. That's what I want to see where this next television deal goes, because I could very likely see where NBC does their 3:30 game is just a random Big Ten game. Who knows? Purdue versus Minnesota. And then they have Notre Dame on at 7. Because I think they had been playing games at 7 with Notre Dame. Where you could tune in. If they're playing Navy, you can tune out and watch the game day game. And so the Big Ten's putting all their games on free television networks. Like, being in the major markets, that's going to work. And I don't see how you're not going to keep making money compared to, like, the SEC. If people aren't paying for ESPN, sure, they might cut an ESPN2 game. But the way the Big Ten's kind of lining it up, where they're like, hey, we're going to be wherever. And Apple supposedly back into the negotiations for some of like you complained about the ACC network. I'm still hoping that the rest of the Big Ten network games are on Apple Plus. Even if they raise and add a sports tier, I don't think they did that for Major League Baseball. They've been putting games on there. But I just want to put on there every time I want to watch a game, I just want to go to one spot. I don't want to have to download Big Ten Network Plus, Fox Sports Plus, or whatever the hell. And then some games are showing me like different games. Just put them all in one spot so that if I know if they're not on TV, I plug into Apple TV and it's there. Because like the NFL did the same thing where it's either on TV, and heck, even if it's on TV, it's still streaming on, what was that, Amazon?
Yeah.
Or like NFL Network. So like, I mean, I guess you had 2 spots to check, but that's still a lot better than what the Big Ten has now. You're either on Fox or you have to go to Big Ten Network, and then they have Big Ten Network Plus, and then I think they have Big Ten Network Extra, actually, which is even more annoying, where you can get like the extra hockey games. And I'm not even saying that that's going to drive the needle. But in terms of this, so just some extra numbers here, which is probably boring. But if you're looking at the 15 most watched teams from last year, Ohio State's number 1, Michigan's number 2, Alabama's number 3, Penn State's number 4, and Georgia's number 5. So 3 of the top 5 teams are Big Ten teams. And then it's pretty even split, the rest of them. It's like Georgia, Oklahoma, Auburn, Michigan State, Notre Dame, Oregon, Wisconsin, Nebraska. Which, how the hell is Nebraska even on there? At this point, they're almost like a joke. I wonder if that was a selling point to USC. Like, hey, you guys can beat up on Nebraska, you know? Like, look, you're losing to Utah lately. Come on. That's a bad look for your program. But Nebraska, they have a history of winning. So when you beat them, Scott Frost will talk about how the game was really close and they almost got you, and you're just too good of a team, so really pump your team up, right? That's how it goes, and then they'll keep extending Scott Frost because they won't know what to do, and he'll be like winning 4 or 5 games. So that's where it's like, all right, well, how else could you sell it? I mean, USC is definitely a travel partner with UCLA. And I think that's going to cut down on travel. It's not like the old Big East. So the old Big East had Boston College and Miami in it. So Miami would have to fly up to Boston College, and like, where else are you playing up there? Nowhere. So they made it work. I think it can work. I don't think the travel things are going to make any difference. But what do you think? Do you think that forces them to add more teams out west?
Well, if they do, and like you add say Oregon, Washington, like that makes a little bit more sense to your pod scheme, where you add them and you have your Western pod, you have your Northern, like you could do it into 4 pods a little bit easier than that way.
Well, see, I have the pods. I tweeted it out on S-Bound Sports. If you go to our Twitter, you can search Southbound Sports. It will come up, so follow us. Under the assumption that they're able to add Notre Dame, which is what this whole thing is behind, if they stick with only adding like the Western schools, I don't think I have Stanford on here, but I think that's one of the leaders. I can sub them in on this real quick because I was reading this as news was breaking. I know you hate the pods, but the Big Ten already plays 9-game schedule, right? So if they're able to get to 20 teams, like I mean, we've been talking about conference realignment for, 10 years now, it seems like. I've thrown out all kind of crazy ideas. I honestly think this could be the best idea and the actually most realistic at the time, where let's say they only add Western teams at this point because eventually they might add 4 ACC teams. And if they're locked into the TV network deal, Notre Dame might not have that because I think their football is with NBC. So really, the only sports that they would lose would be the other sports like basketball or whatever. And maybe they can get out of that deal for cheaper than the other ACC schools. So let's say they jump in the Big Ten. I think you can give them a pod with their traditional rivals, Purdue, Michigan State, and then put them in the East with Penn State and Maryland. And then that way, the way I have my pod set up, you would also get a chance at having like a secondary rival that you would have for that 10th game if they ever go there. The second pod, then you keep Ohio State and Michigan together, Rutgers, Indiana, and Illinois. Kind of weaker underneath, but I think you're going to keep both of those teams happy and say, like, look, Notre Dame, you're in the East with Penn State. Like, you could easily win that division every time. Keeping Michigan State over there to kind of give Notre Dame another rival. I think if you added another Eastern team, Michigan State would be the first one to bump into the Ohio State-Michigan division. The West one might be a little bit weak at this point. I have them both labeled West. This would be more of like the Midwest traditional Big Ten with Northwestern, Wisconsin, Iowa, Minnesota, and Nebraska. My assumption at the time is that they're going to take some extra Pac-12 schools. So you'd have the last pod be USC, UCLA, either Oregon, Washington, Arizona, maybe Utah, Colorado, Stanford. I don't know what they end up doing. But then that way, it's almost like a Pac-12 division, right? Like a mini, we're picking our best teams from the Pac, the Pac-10, or Pac-12, and we're going to make them a pod winner. And it goes back to my idea of having, hey, what if you have 2 Big Ten championship games, right? I think you would have that here with the pod system. So in my idea, how it would work, you would play every division every year. So every 3 years, you would play every single team, which is a lot better than what we're doing now. We barely play Minnesota at Michigan, which is one of our key rivals. So, like for the first year, every year Michigan would play Ohio State, Rutgers, Indiana, Illinois. Then the first year they'd also get Notre Dame, Purdue, Michigan State, Penn State, Maryland. That's at least 4 or 5 primetime matchups for Michigan, at least, with Ohio State, Notre Dame, Michigan State, Penn State. The next year, they would get a little bit of a weaker slate with Northwestern, Wisconsin, Iowa, Minnesota, Nebraska. You still get the Ohio State game. Other big time games in Wisconsin and Iowa and Nebraska, possibly Minnesota too. That's a trophy game. They'd get that one back. Maybe not game day type games, but they're definitely games that could be like on NBC or something. And then the third year, they would get USC, UCLA, Oregon, Washington, and Arizona in this example of what I tweeted out. So you're actually going to play them. I don't think you're going to... those are better schedules than what they've been getting now, because you're not locked into having every week team in the East, right? And then you're not getting only 2 crossover games. You're actually getting 5 crossover games. And then I think you take whatever pod you end up playing, you play the best, like you play the winner of a different one after Thanksgiving as like a non-repeat. Remember how I said we don't want the rematches? So like if Michigan wins that pod like last year, and they had already played Iowa or someone in the year, you played a different pod. I don't know how they would pick it, but I'm assuming it would just rotate back and forth or whatever. And then that way, they don't even have to name a winner, right? The Big Ten can say, these are our 2 regional winners, put them in the playoff. And it's kind of twisting the playoff's hand to say, like, hey, we have 2 good teams, which one are you going to take? Because there is a chance that one of the pod winners is like 9-4, like we talked about last week. But at that point, I think there's enough to where you can kind of game the like extended playoff to say, boom, here you go. We have 2 teams that we're promoting. This year it's USC and Ohio State. Maybe next year it ends up being Notre Dame and Michigan, or hell, Penn State and Iowa. You never know. And then they still have another team that didn't win their pod that might be sitting right there, ready to take it. An at-large bid, if they still do those. I don't know.
But I almost feel like, to a certain extent, you have too much. I want to get, like, from the people that vote on the college football playoff, you have this level of, I want to figure out what the rules are so that I can bend it to get these teams in. And like last year, we'll say, like, there was no way coming down the stretch that 2 SEC teams weren't getting in. Like and it's like, but they're bending it in such a way that I think they're setting themselves up for failure, because then when you have that scenario where multiple SEC teams are down, and I'll just hypothetically use the ACC as an example, if it's a 1-loss Florida State team and an undefeated Clemson team, and Clemson wins the conference championship, they're not going to say, oh, Florida State needs to be in there too. Like, you'll be lucky to get 1, let alone a second team in, even though they're bending it for the SEC or
you're 100% right.
And I think that's what's coming back to bite the NCAA in the ass right now, is that if they just did it, which for all intents and purposes, I think that's where the introducing the BCS started to make more sense, because it took some of the biases of, I think that, you know, even if a team loses a game or 2, that in the back of your mind, if you're saying Ole Miss with Lane Kiffin coaching, they're an exciting team that would generate viewership, we have to figure out a way to get them in. And then you start working backwards of saying, if that's a team that has to be in the playoffs, well then what's the eligibility that you can kind of finagle to get it so that you push? They have it now where, as long as there's reason, like you have enough cause to really state your case, they can push for any team that they really want to make the Final Four. And I think that it hurts in some aspects, because then you're looking at some of these teams, and it's, the fake championships and the stuff that we joke around a lot about. But I think that's why I'm such an advocate of raise it. If you win all your games, I don't care if you make the playoffs or not, raise the banner, because that's all that matters. Is if you can only play the teams that are scheduled for you. You take it a little further, and maybe it does get back to where they start using some form of like the BCS formula, so that if they're expanding playoffs, I think that takes some of that bias out, that you can use those generated numbers and get a more accurate picture of this is what it takes to qualify, and going in, and it's not, well, it doesn't matter what we do, we're screwed before it even gets going, because the way it's aligning now is that you're guaranteeing with the expansion Big Ten's definitely going to be in. You're guaranteeing SEC will definitely be in. Now, who takes the other two seats at the table? I mean, I'd like to think that ACC right now claims one, and then the hodgepodge of everybody else takes the other. But last year proved that they'll put two SECs in, or a wild card Notre Dame.
So I definitely think that you're right where USC was added as a Big Ten response to having teams left out of the playoffs. Because the funny thing was, the year the Big Ten was left out of the playoffs, they actually made $10 million more per team than the SEC. So they didn't need that crutch of having teams in the playoff. I think that was the year. Didn't two SEC teams get in that year too? So they even got the bump from that. Georgia and Alabama. Again, it was in like 2017 maybe. Or no, wait, did Ohio State make it that year? Which year didn't they get in? Was it the Purdue year? I can't remember. But the SEC bump didn't even matter. The Big Ten pulled in $54 million a team. The SEC had like 43. And the stats that I mentioned, where I talked about where miraculously, like in the middle of whatever year, 2026, the SEC jumps on top, right? And the reason that they gave the SEC a bump, in small print, it says here that assumes team bids in a 12-team college football expansion. So in their scenario, they're giving the ACC a bump from $30 million to $60 million or whatever, because they're getting one college football bid every year, and then whatever they get from the other playoff games or whatever. The Big 12 is getting a bump, and the Pac-12 is also getting one bump. The Big 10's getting one bump, two bumps a little bit maybe. The SEC's getting like three or four. Like they're just assuming that, hey, we're just going to put the SEC in. And I think that's why the Big 10 and their alliance with the Pac-12 and ACC, where they said like, no, we don't want to expand the playoff if ESPN's in control of it. And I 100% agree with them. Like Kevin Warren stepped out, the commissioner of the Big 10, and said, we want other conferences to be able to show a game. I'm sure Fox told him to say that, because like they want to be there, but then they also want a seat at the table, because you can't have a backdoor dealing where ESPN's sitting there and saying, who we really need in is Georgia and Alabama, right? Because we can hype that up. You need someone that says like, whoa, wait a second. We own the rights to the Big 12. Like, we need them in there, right? Right now, they don't have that. The Big 12 signed with like Fox or whatever. They're kind of forgotten. So last year, when was it Oklahoma State that was close, or hell, even like Cincinnati, does ESPN own like their rights? I don't even know where their rights are.
Yeah, because if they would have won the Big 12 against Baylor, that would have put them in, and then it would have broke the system.
That's why I think with the ACC, they really screwed themselves, because they didn't look for that other bid. They, for whatever reason, the old commissioner was so enamored with Raycom that they were just cool with, hey, ESPN, you guys take all our rights, and anything else we're just going to sign with Raycom, which was the worst deal. And I think that's why the ACC is so far behind, because like on its face, the ACC is a regional conference that's pretty widespread, and they have big media areas. You would think that they would get a better deal. It reminds me of like the Pittsburgh Pirates, where they're like, hey, yeah, we're getting the fourth most viewership. Hey, are you getting paid for it? Well, no, we just took whatever deal they gave me. It's like, really? Well, yeah, I'm making money. Are you investing in players? Like, no, I don't have to. Like, the deal just doesn't say that. That's kind of like where the ACC is at right now. It's like, yeah, but they told us, because I saw one of the connections, like one of the UNC guys was writing a bunch of stuff about how when they signed the deal with the ESPN guy, the network guy, told them that the ACC, hey, we're doing you guys a favor because you don't know if people cut cable, you might not even get a deal close to $30 million in 5 years. And now look how dumb that was that they fell for that. Like, why would you listen to the guy that's giving you the deal instead of saying, you know what, I should check with NBC first?
But I almost think that was around the time that they did that, where the NBA was like betting against themselves and like upping whatever their cost was for no reason.
Yeah.
So at the time that they added, it was like they plucked a couple teams from the Big East, and it was like they expanded enough that they had consistency within the conference. But what ended up hurting was that it was still a one horse race. It was still Florida State's conference with randomly the other teams coming through. You'd have Duke competing for the Coastal, and then Virginia Tech would poke its head up, and like it was Georgia Tech had a string where they were competitive, and it's like the ACC was always, at least from the football standpoint, they had some decent teams, but they weren't pushing 3 teams that were like 1 or 2 loss that you can start talking it backwards. It was like you would get the majority would be in that, like, I beat you, you beat me, and then I beat this team that you lost to. And it was like the Rock'em Sock'em Robots, where you get enough wins to qualify for a bowl game, but when you look at what the schedule is like, well, I beat this team, but then I also lost to this team, and there was never anything to really strongly give you a solid footing to prove that you need to be a step up, like whether it be for a higher ranking bowl or things like the ACC's always just been passed over.
And that's where I think the Coastal really hurt itself, because they're like, here, Miami, win this division for us. Like, it's clearly made to give Miami a bump, and they're like, we're not going to do that. In fact, we're going to let every team win this division every year. So it's like a different team every year, and you don't get that bump. One of the other things that the networks did say about the Big Ten making more money than the SEC, they kind of said, well, you know that they do play 9 conference games, right? That gives them one more big-time game to sell ads for. That's why they make more money. It's like, the SEC, what do you sound like a bitter old man. Like, the SEC could easily add a 9th game if that's the only difference, right? They just don't, because they want to play Arkansas Pine Bluff before Auburn plays Alabama. They're like, well, we gotta heal up, you know? Like, we can't be having that. And so, like, if the Big Ten, and this is where I think the Big Ten people made fun of them, like, hey, you added Maryland and Rutgers? Guess what? They needed teams they could beat the crap out of, because it inflates the record of the rest of the Big Ten East. And look at it. Last year, you had, 3 10-win teams in the East? Michigan, Ohio State, and Michigan State all had 11-plus wins. You don't get that if you bring in, hey, we're going to fill in our division with the best from the ACC, right? They're not looking at that. They're looking at media markets like, hey, we should bring in Georgia Tech. And the football teams look at each other and they're like, yeah, we can beat the crap out of them. Let's go ahead and bring them in. And they're like, they're in Atlanta, right? That'll really piss the SEC off. Who else should we add? Like UNC, they're a good fit. Like, yeah, they're going to beat us in football? Like, hell no. But they're good in basketball. We really don't care about that. Bring in UCLA, UNC. You already have Indiana and the 2 Michigan schools in basketball. You have, like, the best basketball conference in the country then. Like, at least the most historic. You don't even need to bring in Duke. But people are like, Duke will never get brought in because they suck. I'm like, maybe that's why they get in. Right? Because Notre Dame's looking at it and they're like, who's in our division? And they're going to be like, well, right now, Michigan State and Penn State. And they're like, whoa. How about we do just Penn State and maybe Duke? Boston College? Like, who else should we bring in to beat up on, you know? Notre Dame has that with the ACC. That's why they don't want to join. They know that if they get to 10 wins, even with their schedule being down, they have a chance to be picked as, like, the extra team in the playoffs. And it's been working for them. So why would they want to change that? That's where, like, the ACC, like you're saying, they can't cherry pick which 5 teams they play. Notre Dame's kind of been like, hey, we're going to cut all of our tough rivals. Michigan State, sorry, guys. We can't play you anymore. We got this game against Duke scheduled. And Wake Forest, like, we definitely got to hit them up. And, what? We got 10 wins? And, like, last year they were looking at Notre Dame, and they were like, well, where's your key win? Like, you had no key wins, but you had one key loss to Cincinnati. And then people didn't know where to rank either of them.
But, you know, there's another thing that I was reading about a lot of these conference mergers, and one of the things that I think should be taken into consideration is how teams from a rivalry perspective are being taken in. Because when you look at, like, when West Virginia left the Big East to go to the Big 12, yeah, they got those marquee games against Texas and Oklahoma, but who's their, like, if you go to Morgantown, who's your rival? Like, the biggest one's Pitt. Well, and they haven't played them in how long?
To be fair, that's my second half of the show is who's to blame for all this mess. And West Virginia is not to blame at all. They went to the Big 12 after they were already left behind. Like, they might have made the decision before Pitt got into the ACC, but way back when, West Virginia tried to join the ACC and they did not get the vote. Virginia Tech got picked in because Virginia got schools to vote on their behalf and said, like, well, they're our little brother, we should let them in. And then they brought in Miami or whatever. I think the first vote was maybe West Virginia and Syracuse, and they both got denied by one vote because they were like, well, we definitely don't want West Virginia in because we're a basketball conference here. That's what ESPN wants, basketball. And so they were like, we don't want West Virginia, which I think was a big mistake. Because I think if you made that coastal division like West Virginia, Miami, Virginia Tech, and whatever else, Pitt, then, like you said, you're getting the rivals back together. You're taking the best from the Big East. Instead, they kind of took a hodgepodge, and then they backfilled it with Louisville. I saw people saying, well, Florida State can't leave because they have a great rivalry with Louisville. I'm like, what the hell? What rivalry with Louisville? Like, of all the historical rivalries, I don't think Florida State-Louisville. Like, Louisville was just added late, and they barely got in because their academics were bad, and the ACC almost didn't want to take them. But at that point, like, West Virginia had already joined the Big 12. If West Virginia doesn't join the Big 12, I think they get that last spot over Louisville, and then that's it. But I think the ACC kind of taking teams but being weird about it started this whole thing. The thing that could have changed everything would have been, when was it when we originally talked about this? It was like 10 years ago now. Texas and them tried to join the Pac-12, right? So Texas, A&M, Oklahoma, and Oklahoma State said, hey, we want to join the Pac-12. And the Pac-12 was like, oh, no, we're a West Coast conference. We don't want another time zone here. It's really going to mess up our scheduling. And so then A&M's like, well, all right, well, we need to leave anyway. So we're going to go to the SEC. So then Texas is like, well, A&M and Missouri just left, so we should really go to the Pac-12 now. So then they were like, can we take Texas Tech and us and Oklahoma State? And Pac-12's like, guys, we really don't want you. Like, we're not joking here. And then that started the wheels rolling where Texas and Oklahoma are looking to leave. They didn't have anywhere to go. And the Pac-12 right now, looking back on it, if they take them, I think college football is just four main conferences, right? Because USC and UCLA wouldn't leave. Texas and Oklahoma wouldn't join the SEC. The ACC would probably stand pat because the Big 12 or the Big 10 wouldn't be able to pull Notre Dame. Hell, maybe Notre Dame joins the ACC at that point. And then you're left with four main conferences and four playoff bids, right? Maybe they go to 8, do a couple at large, and then have the other conferences play a play-in game. I think that's what's going to happen now. But I think you just have two main conferences now where they're like the Pac-12. You guys didn't want to bring in football. Like, USC can look at them and say, guys, 10 years ago we asked to bring in Texas and Oklahoma because we wanted more football schools in, and you guys said no. We could have been the first 16-team conference. We could have been there, been locked in, and instead you guys said no, so we're out of here. Like, they went to the SEC, we're going to go to the Big 10, and we'll see you guys later. And now the rest of the Pac-10 has to be panicking. Or are they 12 left? How many are in that conference? Was it a Pac-12 still, or did they have 14 teams? I think they only had 12, right?
Yeah.
So, like, they would have been they would have been the first 16-team conference. I'm looking at it now.
Because they were the Big 8, and then they expanded out. Because it started with A&M and Missouri jumping into the SEC, which then triggered the Maryland response to the Big 10.
Yeah.
and that was where a lot of the reconfiguring of the conferences started to align. And I think rather than them pushing out, a lot of it was like, well, Texas started the Longhorn Network, and I think in theory they leveraged that if they actually were competitive as they were in that early 2000s, where they were playing for national championships, like maybe they maintain the viability of the conference and everything, because just having one team that has that national championship caliber to it could keep the conference afloat, because I think Texas was hoping they could do it for the Big 12. Florida State definitely did it for the ACC for years, that they were in the ACC, and they're the only team that was really being consistently competitive. And it just, there was that effect of, if you have that one team, maybe everyone else can kind of just ride their coattails to keeping their programs relevant. And when that team does not compete on that high level, you see the rest of the conference just sucks into a lower tier. Like even now, when you look at the ACC, like Florida State's down, Clemson really isn't doing as much to keep that consistency going. Like they had the flash in the pan those couple of years, but it's like they're not showing right now that they're going to have that staying power of keeping that ACC relevancy.
That's where, when I look at this too, if you remember a few years ago, the ACC, like Texas still tried to save the Big 12 because they knew they had an advantage with that television deal. Do you remember when they tried to get Florida State and Clemson to jump ship to their conference, promising them like a merit-based pay schedule? Like, hey, if you guys have the Florida State like network, you guys can get paid more. Like, look at us. And then they almost jumped, right? And the ACC ended up redoing their television deal to give them a little bit more money.
Well, and that was part of it. Was
like absurd.
Florida State was winning. Like they were doing all of the winning for the conference, and they're like, "Yeah, we're just going to share all this." Like you're not going to, even though
it wasn't even that. They were also sharing it with Notre Dame, which still pisses me off. It's like, hey, great job, Florida State, but we need to give some of that to Notre Dame real quick. It's like, why? What are you doing? Why are they taking the ACC bowl bid and then taking that money from us? Because that was another reason why they're at an advantage or disadvantage. But that's still like when people were like, hey, I don't know why Texas left. Like it's crazy. It was out of nowhere. It's like, buddy, they've been trying to leave for 10 years. And they've been trying to bring in and try to save the Big 12 with Florida State and Clemson, and they just couldn't get it done. Because like I think any of those moves changes college football, where if they had joined that conference, do we have 4 major conferences instead of 2? Because I think that's what scares everybody, is everyone just assumed that one of the conferences would be dissolved, right? And we would end up with like a nice 16-team, 4-conference thing where everyone had like their own divisions or pods, whatever they wanted to do. But then you'd be able to play each other in a 4-team playoff. I honestly think that's why the 4-team playoff was picked. And then we'll just make up this Power 5 thing real quick just until that happens.
But here's
it never happened though.
But here's another way of like getting to that end is, I'll use the NFL as the example. They had the AFL, they had the NFL, and currently you have the AFC and the NFC, and they have their standard playoff formats where the best team from one conference plays the best team of the other conference. So you could almost do that where you and like we're working towards this merger where you have one that's covering the Big Ten, one that covers the SEC, and then within that you have enough opportunity and you're playing each other through the regular season that now you can say, even if you keep it at 4, take the 2 best teams of the SEC, take the 2 best teams of the Big Ten, and play that out. And now like you're there.
I think that the Big Ten, it wants to take even more control of it, where they say, hey, because back in the BCS game, the Big Ten wanted to do a +1, and the Pac-12, they wanted to do a +1 championship. I don't know if people remember this. But before, like the year that Michigan won the Rose Bowl and Nebraska had won whatever, and they were both undefeated, they had proposed that, why don't we just take whoever wins the Rose Bowl and then whoever's the best of the rest, and they do a +1 national championship game. And they were like, no, that doesn't work. We got to do this BCS thing with the computers because that's the only fair way to know. And now I think the Big Ten's ready to be like, well, we kind of own the Rose Bowl now. What if we just did that ourselves by having these pods where the two champions of each pod play the Big Ten weekend or whatever, where now they're getting paid for 2 championship games, so their television money is going to go up. And then the Big Ten just ends up with like their own little playoff. Because then the champions meet in the Rose Bowl, and then they tell the NCAA or the SEC to say, like, hey, well, here's our champion. Where's yours? Let's play. And the other conferences are like, wait a second. We wanted the playoffs. Or like, and they're like, well, we do kind of have that, but the Rose Bowl is one of them. And the Big Ten is just going to take both of their slots. And then the SEC is like, oh, and our 2 teams will take the Sugar Bowl slot, right? Because we got Texas now, so we really don't need the other conferences. I think that's where it's going to go. And I think that's why these teams are kind of freaked out by it. Because why would you expand? And if the Big Ten just, like you said, claim it, there's no NCAA playoff for football. So what if the Big Ten just said, like, hey, our champion, we're just going to name him national champion? Like, how wouldn't that piss ESPN off? Because the one thing is, it always pissed me off is, like, all these sports championship games are, like, on CBS or whatever. College basketball championship on CBS should not be getting more TV viewers than the college football game, but it's close because of it being on ESPN. And like ESPN, it's a cable network that's dying, and yet all of these playoff games and stuff are forced on ESPN. I think the Big Ten's doing the strongman move and saying, hey, you guys want to do that? We're going to move the Rose Bowl to Fox, and then we want the championship game either like on Fox or let it rotate like the NFL on NBC and CBS. And I think that's where you start to see a lot of other parity come in too. Because like then ESPN's not promoting it only SEC, only all the time. Because even with ACC, like let's be real, does ESPN even promote the ACC? No. And when they do, they promote it like, can Clemson knock off the best from the SEC? Like they're not running an ad like, Clemson's clearly the best team, ACC rolls. They never run that. It's like, Clemson's lucky to be here. Do they have the depth to challenge the SEC best? And like the SEC best might be like a 10-3 team or whatever, and they're like, nope, Clemson just doesn't have it. They're in the lowly ACC. You can watch them on ESPN 9 on Saturday nights at 9:30. Yeah. And it's like, oh, well, thanks for that.
If you're lucky, or you can watch it on SportsCenter tomorrow morning. We'll tell you what you need to know.
And then they'll be like, but Notre Dame's playing Duke at 3:30 on NBC. It's like, all right, awesome, guys. Great work promoting the ACC. And the funniest thing now is like the Pac-12's trying to strike an alliance with the ACC. Just merge. Just merge, right? Because going into the year, I told you there were 10 conferences. I would like to see 10 auto bids, and then the other 6, if they go to a 16-team playoff or a 12-team playoff, make those the at-large, right? Give every conference a fair chance. If I'm a smaller conference right now, like if I'm the what is it, the MAC, I have them up right now. So like if I'm the MAC and Conference USA, I'm saying, hey, why don't we merge? And then we like our schools are kind of in like the same area anyway. Not so much maybe Conference USA anymore. But like the MAC's right there. Why don't we just do the same thing where we kind of do pods and we have a 2-week MAC, whatever the hell they call their conference. We have a MAC Conference USA championship game where after Thanksgiving, it's the semifinals. And then the following week, they have the finals and they put forth this team and say, include us in the playoffs or we're naming ourselves national champions. And then what's the NCAA going to do? Like if they have 4 super conferences or 6 super conferences at that point or whatever, I don't see how the NCAA isn't going to step in and say, hey, we want auto bids. And if you're going to do an 18 playoff, fine, whatever it ends up being. But I mean, there's only 100 like college football teams, right? 100 something. If you did 4 super conferences of like 24 to 32 schools, like that would be your playoff. Each one would kind of be the same. It would kind of be sort of like the Division II or whatever, the playoffs. But instead of having like just at large for all those bids, now you're able to control like, hey, is the SEC in control of their set of the playoffs? Yes. The Big Ten is also going to have their side of the bracket. perfect. And then it will be calling it like college basketball, where it's like, well, Ohio State, they got bumped from their college football tournament early, but you know that they're stacked, so they're rested up. Are they going to be good in the playoffs? Like, yeah. Like, just unfortunate for them to be matched up against USC. USC is awesome. Like, they're probably going to get in too, and then most likely the winner of this Michigan-Penn State game is going to get in. So people are going to tune into that game because they're like, well, holy shit. Whoever wins this game is going to be in the playoffs, right? And then you're going to get all this hype for these other Big Ten games that 5 years ago did not exist, but Fox is getting paid for. And then they're going to say, you know what, Big Ten? We are going to give you $100 million a year. And then the other conferences are going to be like, well, that's not fair. Because like even the ACC, like you're getting $30 million a year. Someone did the math because there's a couple tweets about it where like Miami has been looking into it. I don't know where Miami is going to go. But like they said that their $30 million a year for media rights, if they give that up for 10 years or whatever, that's $300 million. Plus the million exit fee, $400 million. They would make that in 4 years in the Big Ten. So instead of waiting for 10 years, Matt, and making less money, let's just bite the bullet now, pay as much as we can through boosters or whatever, and then in 5 years we'll be out free. Because that's kind of what Maryland's doing. You think Maryland's regretting it? Hell no, they're not regretting it. I just don't know if, like, because like you have to look at it from a business side. Is the Big Ten going to take Miami? I don't know, maybe. Does Fox want the Florida market? Probably they do, right?
I would think they do, but the hardest thing with adding Miami is that if the Big Ten continues to hold true to their researching stuff, I don't see Miami being viable.
Well, see, so for people that aren't aware, the Big Ten used to kind of say that they had this AAU requirement, which is a big research side of things. And recently, like after Nebraska was joined, like they got invited. The Big Ten knew they were going to lose their AAU status because of the way some of the research money stopped counting with Nebraska's hospital being on a different campus, not their main campus or whatever. Kind of like how Penn State has a million campuses. Well, they started this Big Ten academic alliance thing that's already made over $9 billion in research grants. That's over $1 billion a year that's also getting paid out to these schools, Matt. That's not small change. And to my knowledge, I don't think the SEC has anything like that. And that's why people were like, well, UNC is going to join the SEC. It's like the Big Ten plays more sports than the SEC, right? If they keep joining with the Pac-12 schools, I think that's going to keep happening where that conference, mega conference, is going to become like the Olympic conference, okay? So like they're going to have all the sports, like the ones even that you don't care about, like synchronized swimming and like whatever the hell else those California schools are doing. I think they just talk to the Big Ten and say, hey, Fox wants us to show these because like right now they're showing Frisbee on Fox Sports too. Because I looked it up today. I'm like, wonder what they are showing. They're showing Frisbee. So do you think they would be showing Frisbee right now? Or like, let's say, I know it's July, so maybe a couple weeks ago, they'd be showing a hot beach volleyball game between like some like outdoor like dudes like hitting the volleyball around. Like I think they'd rather show that, right? So like why not get all these other teams to play these other sports? Because now you can say like, hey, we're just going to throw you on at any time. People like to watch live sports. They're watching Frisbee. They're watching bowling. Like could you imagine a Big Ten bowling? Because like how many times did ESPN just have bowling on all summer? Like what if the Big Ten and because I guess the Pac-12 doesn't matter. So what if the Big Ten had like Big Ten bowling and it was like your schools or hell even esports too? Because you don't think Apple TV is going to want them to like, hey, we're going to have Big Ten esports championships. And the SEC is kind of like, yeah, we're really focused only on football here. And they're like, well, that's cool. But like, I just don't see like UNC, if they had the choice, would they join the SEC? Possibly because like they're football rivals, but like, it's not a basketball conference. Where are their Olympic sports going to play? Are they going to stay in the ACC or some semblance of it? I don't know. Are they going to say like, hey, we need to do like what Notre Dame's doing? Because like Notre Dame has hockey in the Big Ten right now. And like John Hopkins plays lacrosse in the Big Ten. So like was Arizona State plays hockey already too in the Big Ten? So people were thinking that the Big Ten would just take Arizona State. Maybe. They're not in the AAU. Maybe the academic alliance doesn't matter. That's why everyone keeps saying, oh, well, the SEC is going to take Miami, Clemson, and Florida State tomorrow. No, they're not. The only reason they would do that and ESPN would agree to pay them more is that they are trying to make sure that Fox does not get at the Florida market, right? I mean, I think we can both agree there. Whether it's the rumor that the Big 12 has reached out again as like a way to say like the Big 12 might just become the first 32-team super conference. Because at this point, they don't care. And like, what would you say like if you're West Virginia and you're like, hey, Pitt, you guys, your conference might fall apart if Notre Dame leaves. And if 8 schools leave, you're not going to be one of them. Come play with us. And then we're also going to add Utah and get Colorado back and maybe some of the Arizona schools. And I mean, honestly, if I'm the SEC, yesterday I'm calling Oregon. And I'm saying, hey, do you want to play in the SEC? I don't know what the logistics are going to be. Maybe we'll ask you in Washington. I don't know if they would say yes to the SEC, but if the Big 10 and the Big 12 swallow up all these teams, they're going to have conferences that are bigger than the SEC and are just in every time zone. While the SEC is going to stay very regionalized. And I think with like streaming and all these things, like you don't know what's going to change. Wouldn't you rather have a conference that you can kind of pod up and then do regional again, like smaller regional sections of it, but that you're there for like new media, like esports and stuff? Because like, sure, SEC's like, they're great now, but in 10 years, what if that changes? What if the Big Ten says like, no, we're just going to start claiming Rose Bowl champs as national champs? And like last year, Michigan never plays Georgia. They're just, I mean, it's not like the SEC was undefeated. Like Georgia won one, Alabama won one. On the other hand, Michigan's naming themselves national champ. You never had the Georgia game, so how would you know? What if the Big Ten even did a big baller move and played Cincinnati and beat the crap out of them? And then they named national champs. Like they just did a +1 without the SEC. We don't know what's going to happen. But I'd have to believe that if the super conferences come, it's going to come soon. And I think that we're going to see a lot of movement. And I want to see the conferences just merge to try to take away some of that power. I don't think it's going to stop a school coming in. Like if Miami did the math and they're the one that everyone's leaked out about saying like they're ready to fight it in court, if they can get an offer from one of the other 2 conferences, like what's going to stop them that? And hell, if Miami goes to the SEC, I would love it if Michigan added Florida State the next day. Or not Michigan, but the Big Ten, you know. Because like I said, if you can get into their market, there's no way for the SEC to get into the Big Ten media markets, like the big ones, Chicago, New York. What other ones are they in? They're in the top 4 right now. What even are the top 4 media markets? Let's look it up. It's New York, Chicago, LA, and then what the hell would the 4th one be? Would
it be San Francisco?
Is it Washington? Well, they're not even in San Francisco, really, because that's Stanford.
Well, it'd probably be Austin.
Oh, it might be. Let's look and see. I know I'm missing one. New York, LA, Chicago, Philadelphia. Damn. Like, how are they going to get into Philadelphia? They add in Temple? Like, that's clearly Penn State's territory. And they kind of cornered it with Maryland and Rutgers there, too. Same with New York. Like I said, if the SEC thought that Syracuse could get them New York, they would have already added them. The 5th one is Dallas. Honestly, so I already said, if you're the SEC, I think you look at this map and you say, who can we call? We're going to call Oregon. We're going to call Washington. We're going to call Utah, Colorado. We're going to try to make a Western block of the SEC, right? We're going to get out ahead of this. Because right now, I think, aren't there all their television deals with Fox right now anyway? It's like, what better way to hit back at Fox than ESPN grabbing all those schools that they don't have? Adding Clemson and Miami and Florida State sounds good for football, but like you said, you're adding 3 schools that theoretically could just beat up on the rest of the SEC, not win the conference, I'm saying, but instead of going like 10-2 now they're all going to go 6-4, right? They're just going to beat each other up.
Yep.
How's that going to help the SEC? Right?
But I think when you expand the way that these 2 big conferences are now, I think you have to start ruling out. You have to, like, the way that the conferences are now, where you have a slate of conference opponents, and you're trying to fill some of the non-conference stuff, I think you're right. Like, you want to have it so that your conference games are relatively easy, pick up a couple lower tier, lower level schools, and hope that you don't just completely brain fart and win out. With the way that they're expanding now, I think the direction that this is heading is that it's not going to matter. Be 6-4, but finish as the conference champion, and because you're the conference champion of the mega conference, you get the bid, you get the auto,
and that's how it's going to be. But I still think that there's going to be value unless they create their own playoff that's like that. I don't think they do that because I think that's going to kill a lot of the fans. Like, I still think they need that other lower conference bid where maybe it's a play-in game, right? Because like right now there's 5 smaller conferences, or 6 of them? I think there's 5. If you're like, why don't you nudge them and say like, hey, you guys should merge and become 4, right? Like some of the Pac-12 schools, you're most likely going to have to join the Mountain West. So the Mountain West is one of them. The MAC Conference USA kind of merger I mentioned, like we'll just say you have the MAC, then you have the Sun Belt, and then what's the other one? The American. So you have those 4 teams play as like a play-in to the playoff, like the NCAA basketball tournament already does, right? The first 4. You just call them like the last 4. And then like last year, like Cincinnati might be playing, say Liberty would be forced to be in the conference. Who else is big? Coastal Carolina would be another one, maybe last year. And maybe these are in the same conference, I can't remember. But like that's where you would be. And you're saying like, hey, now you guys have a chance to be in the playoff with the big boys because you're 12-0 Cincinnati, and now you get to play a 6-4 Auburn that won the division or won the conference or whatever. Cincinnati kicks the crap out of them, and then everyone's gambling, everyone's making fun of Auburn. I think that's what the NCAA basketball tournament has that football doesn't have right now. And by not playing that game, because like it very well could happen, UCF beat an Auburn team like a few years ago. What if that was part of the playoff? If you cut USCF completely out and all these other smaller schools, I think you're going to lose fans. Because no longer can you have the dream of like, hey, my school's going to go on a run. Like college basketball, like Loyola Chicago, their goal wasn't to make the championship. They went on a magical run. I mean, they wanted to win the championship, same with Butler, but just making the Final Four to them was like the top goal. If you keep merging and you're taking a playoff game where everyone's in, like, hey, we're all in now, this is how we made it, what casual fan's going to cheer for that? So that's why I would like to see the SEC fight back and try to get into Big Ten territory. I think they could add Cincinnati to bite off some of Ohio State. Cincinnati's hot right now. They're in a different state. SEC could go ahead and get the carriage rates from Cincinnati or whatever. Try to add Oregon and some of those West schools. I would like to see them add Pitt and West Virginia and NC State. If UNC says no, I would say talk to UNC and Virginia first. If they both say no, add Virginia Tech and NC State. And then if they want to add Clemson or whatever, like, and Florida State, then in Miami, go for it. But like, I still think you have to have a Syracuse, a Pitt, some other school. Like, you can't even say Pitt because Pitt could go 7-5 in the SEC. We don't know. Like, you almost have to add Duke and say, all right, we need you to be the new Vandy, right? I mean, because like you have Mississippi State and Ole Miss, teams that had been getting beat up. Now they're adding like great coaches that everyone likes that are like meme worthy. And it's hard to root against them, but it's also being like, all right, well, now who do we want in the SEC to lose? Right? Missouri? South Carolina? Like Vanderbilt? Like, who's a team everyone's supposed to beat? Kentucky? Kentucky had 10 wins last year. Because people are like, well, the SEC has no bad teams like Indiana. It's like, yeah, they do. Kentucky is historically not good. Like, a lot of these teams are historically not good, but they've been investing in coaches where the Big Ten kind of hasn't been doing that. And I'm like, I don't care. Like, what solution's the best solution right now? Is it just getting a multiple playoff team? Is it teams that can win at anywhere? Because I think the Big Ten has a couple teams that can win it all. The SEC has only a couple teams that can win it all. It's not like Mississippi State, does Mississippi State have a better or worse chance than Penn State? Probably a worse chance. A&M's been paying a ton of money. Do you really think that they could that they'd have a better chance than Penn State? I don't know. Maybe. I don't know. They have to get through Alabama. Can they do that? No, really. I mean, it's the same problem. Unless you expand the conference so much that you get into a pod system where A&M doesn't have to get through Alabama unless it's part of their AFC side of things, you know? Pretending like CBS and the AFC is like the SEC and ESPN. And then Fox and the Big Ten is like the NFC. Doesn't matter if the NFC doesn't win the Super Bowl every year. They don't care, right? They still get the viewers. Everyone still hypes up Aaron Rodgers and Tom Brady. And then every once in a while, you get a Tom Brady to come through named Cardell Jones. He wins a title. People go nuts. And they're like, this is exactly what we wanted. Right? That's what I want to see this happen. We talked about it for the entire show. I've been hyped about it. I really would like to see the Big Ten keep going a little bit, do regional pods, get back to it, and kind of take some of the control back from ESPN. I really like how they're doing business first, where they're trying to bring in NBC. They're trying to bring in CBS. While the SEC is kind of staying, hey, we're just going to stick with ESPN, it didn't work out. I mean, I think that's what killed the ACC. And I like some of the ACC football schools. That's why I'm hoping that, like, maybe ESPN will pull them in and say, hey, you guys are going to come. I realize, like, Wake Forest is probably done. Duke might be done. Unless, like I said, the Big Ten's like, we do need teams we can beat up on. And then they bring both them and UNC. I don't know. But that's my final take on it. Like, I think the ACC and the Pac-12, the alliance means nothing. They either should merge or, like, some of those schools could join the Big 12. The Big 12 right now is making the third most money, which a year ago you would laugh at, because when Oklahoma and Texas left, you would think that they would have been the one dissolving, right? I do hate that they're the one that's leading right now, because we really don't need two conferences if there's going to be three mega conferences, both being called Big 10 and Big 12, where their numbers don't mean anything. Dumb. So they need to get on the horn with that and change their name to something else. The Big, I don't even know, nothing big, like the Heartland Conference or something. I think that would be cool.
I think that's North.
The Big North. No, I think the Big 10 stays because they already have the branding. I think the Big 12 needs to become something. Unfortunately, the American Conference is already taken and people think it's a joke. But I did hear the Heartland Conference, which I kind of liked, being thrown around with the Big 12 because it is like the heart of America there with kind of the Midwest, with like Iowa and like Kansas and all them. Why not? That's another reason why I've been kind of coming around on Kansas to the Big Ten too. It's like, hey, if USC could take a pick and UCLA is like, hey, we really like basketball, we should invite Kansas. And USC looks at them and says like, oh yeah, we're not going to Texas this up and lose to them a bunch of times. We'll beat them in football. Bring them in. And Nebraska's like, hey, we used to beat them. That could get Scott Frost his fifth win. Maybe we'll be bowl eligible. And they're like, who else can we invite? Iowa State? Nah. I don't think they're going to keep adding teams in the same state. I think USC and UCLA were only there because of the travel regions. Maybe they get Cal or Stanford. There's rumors that Cal might just cut sports altogether. Same with Stanford now, with NIL. Which is absurd, because Stanford has been winning national championships and everything. So for them to just be like, we're done. Like, isn't that crazy to you?
Yeah, but I could also just see that they're just like, well, we're just going to be academic.
Well, people keep saying about, like, when's the SEC going to make, like, Vanderbilt be like the University of Chicago in the Big Ten, where they just kind of were there and now they're kind of cut out. Like, I don't think they're in the Big Ten at all anymore. It's like, you're a smart school and we're just going to have you not play sports anymore. And then you're just there helping the conference, like, do academic stuff, and then eventually you're gone. And we're going to bring in someone else. But like I said, you can't keep having all these top schools. Like, you realistically can't make a pod in the Southeast Conference that has Florida, Florida State, Miami, South Carolina, and Clemson. You just can't do it. Right? Because, like, what's the winner going to be? 8-4 every year? I don't think Florida State's running through that. Florida's going to run through that. They're going to all beat each other up. And then same with, like, Alabama. Like, maybe they'll get lucky and you can throw Alabama, Auburn, Tennessee, Kentucky or something together with Vanderbilt. Like, that might be one that can get Alabama through every year. But, like, what do you do with Georgia then? Like, is Georgia going to be in the Alabama and Auburn pod? Because that would be insane if Alabama and Georgia were in the same pod when they seem to be the only two schools that are, like, really invested other than A&M and LSU. I would think you would try to reward those pods. But if I'm the Big Ten, I think I call A&M and I call Texas and say, hey, we also need in Texas, guys, and see what they say. A&M seemed to be pissed whenever they invited Texas. So why wouldn't you just say, like, hey, we're already making more money than you guys. Why don't you come down and be the Texas school in the United States Conference? Like, you get to play it in LA. You get to play in New York. We play some games in Chicago. Like, come on. Or you can keep playing Arkansas and losing and going 8-4. Like, why would you not? Ask A&M, hey, who do you want to bring with you? Kansas, Missouri? You want Missouri back? Nebraska? You can beat up on all these guys. They're losers. That's what the Big Ten would pitch. If I was Kevin Warren, I'd call him up right now. Texas might take it, too. Same with Oklahoma. What if they doubled back on the SEC? Then what would ESPN? How would ESPN spin that? Because they're not members yet. They didn't do anything. So is there a payout? Did they sign anything that gave their rights away already? They just kind of signed to join the conference. I thought historically the SEC didn't have binding agreements, right? Because the deals were so good. That's what ESPN always used to say. But that's all I have. What do you think?
I just think as this continues, you may very well end up just seeing two giant super conferences where it ends up pushing to potentially even dissolve what was the NCAA and make that into a different college, because you're looking at how the NILs and the transfer portal are shaping things, that maybe it just takes that amateurism away and it makes it more of a pay system where kids are just going straight out of high school into these paid positions.
But to me, they need the boogeyman. Like, the NCAA is the boogeyman where if something goes wrong, every school hates them. They're like, oh, man, if the NCAA wasn't out to get us. You can go talk to any fan base and say, like, hey, how's the NCAA feel about your school? And every school will say that the NCAA hates them. Right? It'll be like, yeah.
UNC couldn't say that. They're like, we made up classes. We didn't get anything for it.
I can't say anything bad about them. By next week, I might be congratulating them on joining the Big Ten, Matt. Because I'm worried about NC State. My boys down here getting left out. If, like, UNC goes to the SEC, like, does the Big Ten take NC State? I don't think so. But then, like, actually, the more I think about it then, if the SEC does do a dumb move like that and doubles down and just takes Florida State and Clemson, I think you see the same thing we've warned about where they just beat each other up. I think the Big 12 could be a fun conference if they take NC State and Pitt and kind of cherry pick a bunch of these other, like, football schools that aren't really big football schools and then see what happens, you know? Sure, they might not be getting $100 million, but what if over time that big conference where every school is getting like 60 or 70, plus with NILs, they might be able to compete, right? I mean, Boise State competed for years and they were making nowhere near the money. So if you have guys and some donors that can kind of pay in, especially like if Oregon's part of that bid, like, I think that would bring some more excitement to, like, hey, NC State, they're playing Oregon this year, West Virginia at home. Like, I think I'd be more inclined to buy tickets than to see what they have now. Right? If they lose UNC, that would be kind of like, well, there goes their rival. But what if then they could turn that into, like, well, here's our new rival, Virginia Tech. And, like, they just take it to the next level, you know? That's what I want to see. Because, like, that could be a very big fit. Like, get rid of the ACC rivals and start a new thing in this new Big 12, which I call the Heartland Conference. I don't even know if that's a thing. I should look that up, though. If I could spell Heartland. I can't even spell it, so maybe that's not going to work out. I guess there is a Heartland Conference. Damn it. I don't even know what the UCC is, though. I'll have to come up with a new one. Oh, it's a Church of Christ thing. But there's no football conference named that, so maybe maybe they could get it done. I'm sure there's another name, though, that they could put out there. But that's all we have this week. College football. I'm sure next week we're going to be talking about it because I think another domino is going to fall as soon as possible. Maybe I'm wrong. Everyone thought it was going to happen last year, too, and it never happened. But the Pac-12 still has to sign their television rights. So as of right now, all of those schools could leave tomorrow and nothing could be done. ACC is kind of locked in, but I think, was it 8 is what I've heard? 8, somewhere between 8 and 11 schools have to decide to leave that would dissolve the ACC. I don't know if that includes a Notre Dame, but we'll see what happens. That's the one that I want to see those schools play, but I also want to see them. I don't want to see them just join the SEC because, I don't think that's going to add anything to college football. I like having another conference that can kind of steal bids, I don't want just two. So thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.